Today we're going to shoot what is probably the pinnacle of Colt's cap and ball revolver designs, the 1860 Army. These are my 1860 Colt Army model replicas. This is a Pieta base model, and I've had it since about 1990, and I'm pretty sure they don't even make this fluted cylinder model, but for a while that seems like that was all that they were making. So I've had this quite a while. It's the last of 3 guns I got pretty much at the same time, and it has parts of all of them inside of it. And this one is an Uberti made replica. I've had this one since, I would say, 1999, and it's been an excellent gun for me ever since. Now, the story of how these guns were developed is pretty interesting in and of itself. For quite a while, a .44 caliber belt pistol, a gun that could be carried tucked in your waistband or worn in a belt holster instead of on a saddle holster, that was the holy grail of Colt's design. This is the quest they were after. And the problem in developing it was not really design savvy or inspiration, it was metallurgy. Colt's first .44 caliber revolver was the Walker, and as you can see, this is a massive piece of hardware. And in fact, I'll just compare the cylinder of the Army to the Walker, and you can see the Walker is about an inch longer. This gun was the most powerful issued sidearm to the U.S. Army until the 20th century. And in fact, it probably still is the most powerful Army sidearm. It was the most powerful pistol until the introduction of the .357 Magnum. The reason this is so big has a lot to do with metallurgy. In order to accommodate the pressures of a .44 caliber load, you needed a massive gun. You had to have a lot of beef around that cylinder. And in fact, one of the reasons why Walkers are so rare today as collectibles is because, for one thing, they only made 1,100 of them, but for another thing, about 1/3 of them blew up in the field during the Mexican War because they couldn't contain the pressures of a 60 grain charge of black powder and a .44 caliber bullet. And that's the reason that Colt developed the Dragoon series, which is right here. Now, I'm going to show you these 2 guns side by side, and as you can see, the Dragoon series has a much longer cylinder, and it's a much heavier gun than the Colt Army. But this is what they needed to contain .44 caliber pressures, because these cylinders were made out of wrought iron, which is quite a bit stronger than cast iron. None of these guns were made out of cast iron. Cast iron is very hard but brittle. And in wrought iron, essentially the slag is hammered back into the iron and it becomes very fibrous. So it gives it a lot of tensile strength, a lot more than cast iron has, but not enough to control the pressures of a heavy .44 caliber load. Now, that changed in 1855 when the Bessemer process made steel much more affordable. They could produce it on much bigger batches at lower cost. And at that point, spring steel, or silver steel, which is a type of tool or spring steel that has silver in the alloy, became viable for gun parts. And that is what made this gun possible. Now, at first, what Colt tried to do is they tried to take the 3rd model Dragoon and shave it down to belt pistol size. And what they got was an ungainly, ill-balanced piece of gear. So they decided to take another approach entirely. And what they did instead is they took an 1850 Navy and they turned it over to their designers and basically said, what do you have to do to upsize this just enough to accommodate .44 caliber pressures? And the result is this gun right here, which the 1860 Army, which I think may be one of the best cap and ball 6 guns of all time. And what they did is they took the Navy frame, which you can see here, and that became the basis for the 1860 Army. On the 1860 Army, they took the cylinder and they increased the diameter of the front portion of it. So as you can see, the 1850, the cylinder is straight, and on the 1860, it steps up. And it's bored two different sizes inside. Now, a lot of the replicas are bored 44 all the way through, but they shouldn't be. They should be bored 36, 375 in other words, and then 451. This cylinder is also a little bit longer than the Navy's. We'll just put them side by side, and hopefully you can see that we're marginally longer. And what that means is the forcing cone on the Navy is longer than the forcing cone on the Army. They just cut the forcing cone on the barrel back to accommodate the slightly larger cylinder. They cut the water table of the frame so the cylinder would be able to fit in with the bump out for 44 caliber. And basically that's all they had to do here. Now on the barrel they made some changes, and sometimes I wish they hadn't. But the Navy had a 7.5 inch barrel, and it had this hinged loading lever. And they modernized the Army by making the streamlined round barrel, and the loading lever is a rack and pinion. And I give you a look right inside there, as you can see. It's just like a rack and pinion steering system, and it is much stronger and it's much smoother than the hinge. Now the streamlined barrel was a big benefit to Colt because it was a lot cheaper to make than the octagon barrel that they had on the Navy. And that made this gun more economically viable because it's easier to polish a round surface than it is to polish the 8 flats on an octagon. And having made octagon barrels, I can tell you that that is absolutely the case. So those were the differences for the cylinder, the frame, and the barrel. Now the grip, the Army grip, I'm going to try to get these so that you can see. The Navy grip is just like a Colt Peacemaker currently. So if you're used to a single action Colt Army revolver, the 1873, well, this grip is virtually the same. The Army grip has a much longer grip. And they're both very comfortable grips. I actually prefer the Navy grip, but I like the Army grip as well. And I'll be honest, the 1860 Army is my favorite cap and ball 6-shooter. The only thing I would say I like better are 44 caliber Navies, and they're not really period correct. But I do have a pair of them. But the 1860 Army was hard-hitting, well-balanced. Even though that grip frame is longer, it still is a natural pointer. So they retained that facility from the Navy. So those are the main differences between the Navy model and the 1860 Army that we're going to be looking at today. Now next I'm just going to show you a disassembly of this very quickly because all Colts operate like this. Except for Patterson's, the very earliest Colts. Colt's first attempt at gun making was in Patterson, New Jersey, and he went bankrupt. But all subsequent Colts from the Walker on really share some design features that make them very modular. And by the way, because this frame is basically a Navy frame that has a step cut in it, the Navy grips will fit on here, and that was a very popular modification back in the 19th century. But these guns come apart into 3 assemblies very easily. This pin right here goes through what's called the arbor and ties everything together. So we're going to tap that out. Now this will probably come out pretty easily. We'll see. I'm just going to hit a plastic mallet and pull it out, and yes, it does. So we're going to be able to take this out. Now, if that had stuck, I've made just a wedge pusher over here, which I would have hit with a hammer to push that through, and this is just made out of a hardwood dowel carved down. But and I always have this in my black powder shooting kit. But for many years, and still now, I made wedge pushers out of clothespins, and this one I've carved down. But you can just take a clothespin leg as it is, just pull a clothespin apart, makes a perfect wedge pusher. They break pretty easily, but who feels bad about breaking a clothespin, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to put this gun on half cock, and you'll see why in a second. I've got the wedge pulled out. The easiest way to remove the barrel now is to take the rammer, and it is going to hit right on the face between the cylinders. And that's just going to push it right off, so you don't have to exert any effort. And if it's heavily fouled, that's certainly the way to do it. So we've got the barrel and loading lever assembly, the cylinder, and the frame and grip frame. And this is usually sufficient for cleaning them. If you've been shooting it quite a bit, you might want to take off the grips and remove all of the internal parts. I do that every couple of range sessions and just clean everything down. But from here, you're good to go. You know, with a nipple wrench, you can pull all the nipples off the cylinder, clean this out. You can clean the barrel from the rear. As you can see, it's beautifully clean and shiny right now. And then make sure you oil this base pin. This is on a Colt that's called an arbor on black powder Colts. Just like this part of the frame right here is called the water table. And now we'll just put it right back together. We'll just go in the opposite sequence from the way we took it apart. Get that started. There we go. Get that wedge started. And we'll get it through to where it needs to go. Now, that's a little bit tight. One thing about this wedge is because it's tapered, it can put more or less pressure and change the barrel and cylinder gap. So you really want it so that you just have the spring catch is just catching right here on the opposite side of the barrel. But should your wedge get battered and your barrel starts loosening up, you can tap it in tighter to tighten it up until you get a new wedge. Alright, let's take this thing out to the range and put it through its paces. I'm not going to show you the loading sequence because it seems like I've done that in several videos and it's the same as all the other black powder Colts. So we're just going to take this out and shoot it. Though it does take 30 grains of powder and a 4.54 round ball. That's what I use in it. In case you thought things always go smooth for me on the range, here's living proof that that's not always the case. Okay, we jammed up there because of a very common failing of the Colt. I hope you can see that copper piece in there. That's where a cap is dropped down and block the hammer, and that effectively jams things up. We'll get it out and get back to shooting. Alright, we cleared that cap and we're ready to go back to shooting. Earlier I was shooting the Pieta, now we'll let the Verdi 1860 Army make some smoke. And we'll finish off with a gunfighter's view of the 1860 Army. I hope you enjoyed it.